Keanu Reeves had never been one for grand entrances. He didn't need extravagant gestures or flashing cameras to command attention. His presence, quiet yet unmistakable, had a way of shifting the energy of a room without effort. On a serene Friday night, he walked into Elysian Grace, a renowned fine dining establishment known for its opulence and impeccable service. Nestled in the heart of Los Angeles, the restaurant exuded elegance. Soft golden light cascaded from grand chandeliers, illuminating tables draped in crisp white linens. Delicate candles flickered beside polished crystal glasses that gleamed like scattered diamonds under the ambient glow. The hum of refined conversation and the occasional clink of silverware against porcelain filled the air, creating an atmosphere of understated luxury. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story for you. Keanu's arrival was unassuming, dressed in a simple white button-down, slightly creased from the day's wear, and well-worn jeans that had softened over time. He appeared more like a weary traveler than a Hollywood star. His dark hair fell in natural waves, slightly tousled, framing a face marked by quiet contemplation rather than celebrity vanity. The shift in the restaurant was almost imperceptible. Conversations slowed, forks hesitated mid-air, and a few glances flickered in his direction. "Who is that?" someone murmured. But just as quickly as curiosity sparked, it faded. His presence lacked the ostentation typical of the wealthy patrons who dined here. Men in tailored suits, women draped in designer gowns. In their eyes, he could have been anyone. A businessman stopping in after a long day, an artist drawn in by the warmth of the lights, or simply someone who had wandered into a world not quite meant for him. At the front podium, Samantha stood poised. She was in her early 30s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. The uniform she wore, a tailored black blazer over a pristine white blouse, was as precise as her demeanor. She took pride in maintaining the exclusivity of Elysian Grace, in ensuring that every guest fit the unwritten code of refinement. As Keanu approached, her professional smile faltered for the briefest moment. Her gaze swept over his attire, lingering a fraction too long on his scuffed leather boots, shoes that had clearly seen years of use. "Good evening," Keanu greeted, his voice low and warm. "A table for one, please." Samantha's lips curved into a polite yet measured smile. "Of course, sir," she responded, her tone flawlessly courteous, though her eyes revealed quiet skepticism. She flicked through the leather-bound reservation book, though she already knew there was space. Still, her hesitation lingered, a silent assessment. Glancing up briefly, she surveyed the dining room. The prime tables, bathed in the perfect glow of chandeliers, were occupied by well-dressed guests who sipped aged wine and dined on dishes crafted like works of art. Then, without so much as a question, she closed the book with a soft thud and gestured for him to follow. Keanu trailed behind as she walked past the central tables, the ones reserved for regulars, socialites, and those who belonged. Instead, she led him toward a more secluded area near the kitchen doors, where the faint scent of simmering sauces and freshly baked bread lingered in the air. "This should be perfect for you," she said, setting the menu down with an almost imperceptible edge to her movement. The contrast between this dimly lit corner and the main dining area was stark. The difference was intentional. Keanu remained unfazed. His eyes swept over the space, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady, void of resentment. Samantha tilted her head slightly, her smile turning just a touch more self-satisfied. "If you need any help with the menu, let me know," she added smoothly. "Some of our dishes might be a bit difficult to navigate for first-time guests." Her words, though laced with politeness, carried an unmistakable undertone, one that suggested she had already made her judgment about him. Keanu met her gaze, his expression calm yet kind. "I'll be fine, thanks," he replied, flipping open the menu without another word. For a moment, Samantha hesitated, as if waiting for a reaction. When none came, she gave a small, almost triumphant nod before turning on her heel and walking away. At a nearby table, An elderly couple, Howard and Ellen, quietly observed the exchange between Keanu and the hostess. Howard adjusted his glasses, lowering his voice to a hushed murmur. "Did you see that? Samantha always tries to maintain the so-called prestige of this place," he said, shaking his head slightly. Ellen sighed, her gaze lingering on Keanu. "It's a shame. He seems perfectly polite." Howard nodded in agreement, but remained silent. The subtle but unmistakable way Samantha had led Keanu to the least desirable section of the restaurant was not lost on them. Keanu, meanwhile, remained unaffected. He flipped through the menu at a leisurely pace, seemingly unaware of, or perhaps indifferent to, the judgmental glances cast in his direction. He exuded an effortless calm, completely at ease in his surroundings, as if oblivious to the subtle social barriers Samantha had tried to impose. At the front podium, Samantha exchanged a glance with her colleague, Lucas, a young, soft-spoken server who had only been working at Elysian Grace for a few months. Unlike Samantha, Lucas had not yet adopted the air of exclusivity that the establishment's more seasoned staff carried with pride. Samantha leaned slightly toward him, lowering her voice but ensuring her words were laced with unmistakable authority. "Did you see that guy?" she murmured, her voice sharp and edged with quiet disapproval. "He has no idea where he just walked into." Lucas hesitated, glancing toward Keanu's table. He didn't see anything out of the ordinary. If anything, the man seemed composed, confident, even. "I don't know," Lucas replied hesitantly. "He looks fine to me." Samantha scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Fine? Look at him. This place is for people with status. He doesn't belong here." Lucas frowned but said nothing. He had always admired Samantha's efficiency, her ability to manage the front of the house with precision. But there were moments, like this, when he felt an unease about the way she judged people so quickly. As the evening progressed, Samantha found herself glancing toward Keanu's table more often than she cared to admit. There was something about his presence, his absolute lack of discomfort, that irritated her. She had expected at least a flicker of uncertainty, a sign that he felt out of place, a nervous glance around the restaurant, or an awkward hesitation over the menu. But there was none of that. Instead, Keanu sat with the quiet confidence of a man completely at home in his own skin. He wasn't gawking at the decor like someone unaccustomed to fine dining. He wasn't fidgeting, wasn't looking around to see if anyone was watching him. If anything, it was as if the grandeur of the restaurant was an afterthought to him. He ran a finger lightly over the edge of the menu, scanning the selections with measured ease, his posture unshaken by the whispers or the weight of scrutiny. His presence alone seemed to challenge Samantha's assumptions in a way she hadn't anticipated. Lucas, catching Samantha's repeated glances, couldn't help but smirk. "Still watching him?" he asked, his tone teasing but laced with curiosity. Samantha pursed her lips. "I just don't get it." "Get what?" "Most people, when they don't belong somewhere, they know it. They fidget. They hesitate. But him? He acts like..." She trailed off, annoyed at her own inability to put it into words. Lucas chuckled. "Like he's been here 100 times before?" Samantha shot him a glare. "Exactly." Lucas shrugged, a knowing glint in his eye. "Maybe that's because he belongs here more than you think." Samantha scoffed, dismissing the notion, but even as she turned away, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something about Keanu Reeves that she couldn't quite place. After much hesitation and curiosity, Samantha finally strode toward Keanu's table, her posture poised, professionalism tightly wrapped around her like armor. In one hand, she carried a sleek black notepad, the pen delicately balanced between her fingers. "Have you decided on your order?" she asked, her voice smooth but carrying the faintest edge of skepticism. Her tone was polite, excessively so, but beneath its surface, there was a subtle scrutiny, an unspoken doubt about whether the man before her truly belonged in a place like this. Keanu looked up from the menu, his expression serene as if he hadn't noticed or simply didn't care about the underlying judgment in her voice. He met her gaze with a calm, effortless confidence. "I'll have the Wagyu beef, medium rare," he said evenly. his voice steady yet unassuming. For a split second, Samantha's professional mask cracked. Her eyes widened just enough for a flicker of surprise to pass through them before she quickly composed herself. She had not been expecting that. Wagyu beef, one of the most luxurious items on the restaurant's menu, prized for its exquisite marbling and melt-in-your-mouth texture. It came with a hefty price tag, $400 for a single serving. Samantha's lips twitched into a slight smirk, her amusement barely concealed. She tilted her head, allowing just the right amount of condescension to seep into her next words. "Are you aware of the price of that dish?" she asked, her voice laced with the kind of faux concern that masked an underlying challenge. For a brief moment, the air around them seemed to still. The question, though wrapped in feigned courtesy, carried a weight that lingered between them. Keanu, however, remained unfazed. His gaze never wavered, his features utterly unreadable. Then, with the slightest tilt of his head, he answered, "I am." His response was simple, 2 words, yet delivered with such quiet certainty that it instantly shifted the energy between them. Samantha's smirk faltered, her amusement momentarily displaced by something else. Confusion? Annoyance? She wasn't sure. She had expected hesitation, perhaps even embarrassment. Instead, she was met with an answer so effortlessly composed that it left no room for further probing. Realizing she had no more ground to stand on, she forced a short nod, flipping open her notepad with a bit more force than necessary. "Very well," she said briskly, scribbling down his order. Yet, as she wrote, she couldn't help but steal another glance at him. No nervous tapping of fingers, no shifting in his seat, just pure, unwavering composure. At the table beside him, Howard had been watching the exchange unfold with thinly veiled amusement. He leaned slightly toward his wife, Ellen, a quiet chuckle escaping his lips. "This is going to be interesting," he murmured, his eyes twinkling with anticipation. Ellen gave him a knowing smile, shaking her head slightly. She had seen men like Keanu before, not necessarily in Hollywood, but in life. The ones who didn't need to prove anything, yet somehow always seemed to be a step ahead of everyone else. Samantha, on the other hand, turned on her heel, striding toward the kitchen with an expression that teetered between irritation and intrigue. As the night unfolded, she would come to realize that this particular guest was unlike any other she had ever served. And soon, the entire restaurant would see it too. It wasn't long before Anna, the restaurant's manager, appeared. She carried herself with the effortless grace of someone used to commanding a room. Her posture tall, her movements refined. Every detail of her attire, from her perfectly pressed blazer to the polished elegance of her heels, spoke of authority and meticulousness. She had been making her usual rounds, ensuring that the evening was running smoothly. But as she scanned the restaurant, her gaze landed on Keanu. Anna's steps faltered ever so slightly as her eyes locked onto Keanu Reeves. For a brief moment, the confident rhythm of her movements wavered, not enough for most to notice, but just enough for those with a keen eye to catch it. A flicker of recognition passed over her otherwise composed expression. It was as if a long-forgotten memory had suddenly resurfaced, an unexpected collision between past knowledge and present reality. She recovered quickly, smoothing her blazer with practiced ease. But something about her demeanor had shifted. Her signature air of effortless control was now laced with something else, an awareness, a realization of who exactly was sitting in her restaurant's least remarkable corner. As she approached, the hushed murmurs of the other staff didn't escape her notice. Samantha, the head waitress, stood stiffly near the bar, clutching her notepad as if it were a lifeline. Lucas, the young waiter, cast nervous glances between Keanu and Samantha. Uncertainty etched across his features. Even the sommelier, usually absorbed in the delicate dance of recommending wine pairings, had paused mid-step, his gaze fixed on the unfolding scene. Anna had worked in hospitality long enough to recognize when something was amiss. By the time she reached Keanu's table, she had pieced together the general nature of the situation, the misplaced judgment, the dismissive treatment, The quiet but undeniable presence of a man who had been overlooked simply because he did not fit the expectations of the restaurant's usual clientele. Yet, Keanu himself remained utterly composed. He was not flustered, not resentful, just waiting. Anna offered a warm, practiced smile, but it was no longer just an obligatory display of professionalism. This smile carried an edge of genuine respect. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice smooth but tinged with something akin to admiration. "It is truly an honor to have you here." Silence fell across the nearby tables. Samantha's face was drained of color. Lucas, standing just behind her, visibly tensed. Keanu inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. He neither basked in the revelation nor dismissed it. He merely acknowledged it. Anna, ever the professional, continued, though there was now an unmistakable shift in her tone. "Had I been aware of your presence earlier, I would have personally ensured your experience here was nothing short of exceptional." There it was, a carefully worded acknowledgement, not just of his status, but of the misstep that had occurred before her arrival. Keanu's lips twitched slightly, the barest hint of amusement in his otherwise calm features. "That's kind of you," he said simply, his voice carrying the same quiet grace that had held the room's attention all evening. Samantha, standing just behind Anna, swallowed hard. Her fingers curled tightly around her notepad. Howard, the elderly gentleman who had been observing the night's events unfold with unwavering interest, leaned toward his wife, Ellen. His voice was just a whisper, but the weight of his words was undeniable. "That explains a lot, doesn't it?" Ellen nodded, her eyes flickering toward Samantha, whose carefully crafted superiority had crumbled into silent distress. Anna, however, was not one to leave matters unresolved. She turned toward Samantha with a measured, knowing gaze, one that carried no outward malice but was impossible to ignore. "Samantha," she said, her tone firm but not unkind, "I trust you have ensured Mr. Reeves's experience here has been up to our usual standards?" Samantha hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. It was enough. Keanu, sensing the moment, intervened before the silence could stretch into something more uncomfortable. "She's been attentive," he said, his voice light but carrying an unmistakable depth. Anna's brow lifted ever so slightly. She was perceptive enough to catch the subtle weight behind his words. Samantha's hands clenched at her sides, but she did not speak. There was nothing to say. Anna inhaled slowly before turning her full attention back to Keanu. "Please allow me to personally see to the remainder of your evening, Mr. Reeves," she said. "It would be my pleasure." Keanu studied her for a moment, as if gauging the sincerity behind her words. Then, he nodded. "I appreciate that." With that, the tension in the air began to dissolve, slowly, but unmistakably, as Anna motioned for the sommelier to bring over a carefully selected bottle of wine. Samantha took a quiet step back. Her hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with something far more potent, understanding. Howard, watching it all unfold, shook his head with a quiet chuckle. "You know," he murmured to Ellen, "I have a feeling this restaurant just learned a lesson it won't soon forget." Ellen nodded, her lips curling into the faintest smile, and a well-deserved one at that. Across the room, the hushed conversations resumed, but now they carried a different tone. There was no longer idle gossip or careless whispers. There was reflection, a ripple effect from the presence of one man who had never once needed to raise his voice to make an impact. As the evening continued, Anna ensured that Keanu's experience was, as she had promised, nothing short of exceptional. But beyond the carefully poured wine, the expertly prepared meal, and the polished service, something far more significant had taken place. Perceptions had shifted, lessons had been learned, and one man, without demanding anything, had reminded an entire room of people what it truly meant to respect another human being. And then, everything changed. Her steps faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of recognition flashing across her face. Her composed expression shifted into something else, surprise, disbelief, and then, unmistakable realization. Without hesitation, she moved swiftly across the dining floor, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble. As she neared his table, her professional demeanor melted into something warmer. A genuine smile spread across her lips, the kind that wasn't forced or measured but filled with sincerity. "Mr. Reeves, what an absolute honor to have you dining with us." The entire restaurant fell silent. Conversations came to an abrupt halt. The gentle clinking of silverware against fine china ceased. Patrons who had been engrossed in their meals now turned their heads, eyes widening in astonishment. Samantha stood frozen, her notepad still clutched in her hands. The color drained from her face as her mind scrambled to process what she had just heard. "Mr. Reeves? Keanu Reeves?" The realization hit her like a freight train. All at once, the subtle condescension, the questioning of his presence, the way she had scrutinized him, every moment of it came rushing back. And now, the weight of her mistake pressed down on her with undeniable force. She had treated Keanu Reeves, one of the most beloved and respected figures in Hollywood, as if he were some unworthy outsider. The sheer irony of it made her stomach drop. Her throat went dry, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. Around the room, hushed whispers began to spread like wildfire. "Wait, that's Keanu Reeves? The Keanu Reeves? Oh my God, I didn't even recognize him." At the table beside him, Howard and Ellen exchanged knowing glances. Howard chuckled under his breath, leaning toward his wife. "Told you this would get interesting." Keanu, for his part, remained as composed as ever. If he noticed the shift in the atmosphere, he didn't acknowledge it. He simply offered Anna a polite nod, his demeanor as effortlessly humble as it had been since the moment he stepped into the restaurant. "Thank you, Anna," he said, his voice steady and kind. "I appreciate the warm welcome." Anna clasped her hands together, beaming. "Had I known you were dining with us tonight, I would have ensured you had the finest table in the house," she said apologetically, her tone filled with genuine warmth. Keanu shook his head lightly. "That won't be necessary," he assured her. "I'm perfectly happy where I am." It was such a simple statement, yet it held so much weight. The guests, the staff, everyone understood what he meant. He hadn't come here for special treatment. He hadn't needed to be recognized. He had simply wanted a meal, like any other guest. And yet, the way he had been received had spoken volumes about the way people judged others based on appearances alone. Samantha swallowed hard, her hands gripping the notepad so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her pulse pounded in her ears as the weight of her actions bore down on her. The man she had subtly dismissed, the one she had questioned and condescended to, was now being addressed with the utmost reverence by her superior. Anna turned toward her, finally noticing the look of utter mortification on her face. "Samantha," she said, her voice kind but firm, "would you please ensure Mr. Reeves receives anything he needs? On the house." Samantha barely managed to nod. Keanu, however, glanced at her and spoke before she could step away. "Actually," he said gently, his tone free of anger or resentment, "I think I already have everything I need." He met her eyes, his gaze neither scolding nor smug, just steady, understanding. Samantha felt her stomach tighten. He wasn't angry. He wasn't demanding an apology. He wasn't humiliating her in front of everyone. And somehow, that made her feel even smaller. This wasn't just about recognizing a celebrity. It was about recognizing the mistake she had made in assuming who deserved respect. Keanu's quiet humility spoke louder than any reprimand ever could. As Anna continued speaking with him, ensuring that he was well taken care of, Samantha took a slow step back. Her fingers trembled slightly as she clutched her notepad, her mind still reeling. Around her, the energy of the restaurant had shifted entirely. Guests who had ignored him before now looked at him with awe. Staff members who had barely paid him a second glance were now attentive, standing ready to serve. And yet, Keanu remained exactly the same, unchanged, steady, a man who had never needed recognition to know his worth. Samantha let out a shaky breath. She had misjudged him, and she knew, in that moment, that she would never make that mistake again. The restaurant stood still, wrapped in an almost sacred silence. The weight of an unspoken realization pressed heavily upon every person in the room. Conversations had stopped. Silverware remained untouched, and glasses sat idle, condensation trailing down their polished surfaces. It was as if the air itself had thickened, turning the once bustling dining hall into a place of reflection. The laughter that had filled the space earlier now felt like a distant memory, replaced by quiet contemplation. Keanu Reeves, the man who had been seated in the most unassuming corner, the man whose presence had been overlooked, finally stood, and every pair of eyes followed. There was no dramatic pause, no theatrical motion to demand attention. He didn't clear his throat, didn't adjust his posture to appear larger or more imposing. He simply stood. Yet in that moment, his presence was undeniable. His gaze swept over the room, not in judgment, but in understanding. He let the moment breathe, allowing everyone to feel the silence, to let it settle into their bones. Then, with a voice neither loud nor rushed, he spoke. Respect isn't something you give based on appearances or wealth. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of something far greater. They didn't need embellishment or flourish. They were truth, pure and undeniable. It's something you offer to everyone, simply because they are human. His voice was steady, his tone measured, but there was no mistaking the depth behind his words. A shift rippled through the room. Some lowered their heads, others swallowed hard. A few stole nervous glances at one another, as if searching for reassurance. Because his words weren't just for the staff. They weren't just for Samantha, the waitress who had made assumptions about him. They weren't even just for the restaurant manager, whose initial hesitation had spoken volumes. They were for everyone. The businessman who had chuckled at the young boy's outburst, the socialites who had turned away in indifference, the elderly couple who had watched in quiet curiosity. Every single person in that restaurant had been given a mirror to look into. At a nearby table, Howard, the elderly gentleman who had been watching the events unfold from the very beginning, leaned in toward his wife. Ellen, his voice, usually rich with laughter and warmth, was now filled with something else, something heavier, more profound. He didn't need to say much. Howard murmured, shaking his head in admiration. His presence alone taught us the lesson. Ellen nodded, her delicate fingers brushing absently over the pearls at her throat. And what a lesson it was. But Keanu did not linger to see their reactions. He did not stand there, waiting for applause or validation. He didn't turn toward Samantha, expecting an apology, nor did he bask in the admiration now filling the eyes of the people who had once dismissed him. He didn't need to. He had spoken his truth and trusted that those who needed to hear it would understand. And they did. Across the room, Samantha still held her notepad, her fingers gripping the edges as if they were the only thing keeping her upright. Her stomach twisted with the weight of realization. She had been so sure, so certain of her own judgment. The way she had looked at him, the quiet condescension in her voice, it all replayed in her mind like a cruel echo. But Keanu had not embarrassed her. He had not demanded anything from her. Instead, he had shown her the very thing she had failed to give him, grace. Her hands trembled slightly as she took a hesitant step forward. "Mr. Reeves," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Keanu turned, his expression unreadable but kind. She hesitated, struggling to find the right words. But in the end, she realized she didn't need them. Instead, she simply bowed her head, a quiet acknowledgement, a silent apology. Keanu gave a small nod in return, an unspoken understanding passing between them. No resentment, no anger, just acceptance. Then, he turned to the young boy who had started it all, the child who had been ignored, dismissed, until the truth had become undeniable. Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp bill. "For your meal," he said, extending it to the boy. The child's eyes widened. His small hands remained at his sides, unsure. But before he could refuse, Keanu crouched slightly so they were at eye level, and for standing up when no one else would. The boy hesitated, his fingers twitching as they hovered over the bill. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't even about the meal. It was about being seen. It was about being heard. For the first time that night, a hint of a smile ghosted across the boy's lips. The silence in the restaurant remained, not from discomfort, but from reverence. There were no murmurs, no whispers. It was as if no one dared break the spell of the moment. Keanu turned toward the exit. He didn't need to stay. His lesson had been given. As he reached the door, Anna, the restaurant manager, stepped forward. Her composure regained, but her voice carrying something new: admiration. "Mr. Reeves," she called, her tone steady but filled with gratitude. "Tonight was unforgettable. Thank you." Keanu paused for only a moment. He nodded once, then pushed the door open, stepping into the crisp night air. The restaurant remained frozen, the echoes of his presence lingering long after he had left. Howard exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "We won't forget this night."